Good morning. We're going to get started now. So I want to welcome you to the second coffee hour of the Solidarity Committee on the Americas, or of the Americas. We never really decided which. So, and it's a committee of WHAM. Today we're going to focus on Bolivia and the U.S.-backed coup against the elected government of Evo Morales. And I just want to make a couple of announcements. One is that Carla Reilly here is live streaming this. If you don't want your face shown, raise your hand now so she can know. Carla, there's one person.
Okay.
I can move. You want me to move?
Yeah, to the back.
Anybody else? Okay. The other thing is, during this, feel free to get up and get food, and this is relaxed. So, and we do have a timekeeper later when we have Q&A, and that's Mary Jean Babcock, who's right back there. So she'll tell you to be quiet if you go too long. But we'll talk about that later. So we're doing this because, in case some of you might have noticed, there's a lot of turbulence around the world, particularly in South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we were looking at some of the different countries in our hemisphere that are having turbulence. And in the last week, obviously we'll be talking about Bolivia and the protests there and what's happening there with the government. Chile has been having protests. Colombia is having a general strike. Dominica, I don't know how many of you are aware of what's happened in Dominica? Dominica is a small island in the Caribbean, and they had an election on Friday, and the right wing, helped out by the OAS and the US, were doing huge amounts of protests, blocking the streets, so that they wanted to stop the election. They weren't able to do that, and what is it? It's called the Labor something party in Dominica won, not the right wing, and they won by a landslide. So, but don't think that that's the end, because it wasn't the end in Bolivia. So, but at least it's one step in the right direction. And it's kind of amazing because Dominica has only 75,000 people in it. You kind of wonder why the U.S. is interested in them. Well, one of the things is they're close to Venezuela. So, so other countries, Haiti has had months and months and months of brutal protests and repression by the government. Obviously, we all know about Venezuela and Cuba because that's been going on for years. And in Cuba, the blockade has been strengthened more and more recently. Every day, it seems like Trump makes a new announcement about how they're going to repress Cuba more. Honduras, there's just also long-term protests, and this last week, one good thing happened, which is the 7 people who killed Berta Cáceres were found guilty and are going to be in prison. However, they were not the source of the attack on her, and nobody has gotten near them, whoever that is. So, in like other countries like Ecuador, Puerto Rico, Peru, Uruguay, Argentina, all of them just have so much turbulence. One good thing that happened this week was in Brazil, but also one not good thing, which was that there were murders in the favelas, and there were a lot of protests in the favelas, but Lula and other people in his government had, on Thursday I think it was, got a summary acquittal by the federal magistrate. Again, we don't know if that'll stick, but at least it's one step in the right direction, like in Dominica. So we're really in this time of incredible turbulence, and we thought it was important to have a deeper focus on some of the countries that have a lot going on there. And so we're starting with Bolivia. I always say Brazil instead of Bolivia. Bolivia, because of the coup that happened a few weeks ago and the repression that's going on now. So I wanted to pass around one map. I don't know if all of you are aware that Bolivia was a much larger country and that parts of it were ceded to Brazil, Chile, twice to Brazil, and to Paraguay. So I'm going to pass this around so you can look at the parts that were ceded. There's a area right near Argentina that's very close to Bolivia, and one of the interesting things about Bolivia was that Ivanka Trump went to that part of Argentina to visit. Oh, okay, to visit. And that she came with aid to the opposition, and this is before the coup. And a lot of people don't know that she has that role of bringing aid to opposition. So anyway, I will pass this around. So how it's going to go today is our speaker's going to talk for half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we're going to have Q&A. And then once we end using Skype, we will have an open discussion about the whole situation in Bolivia. But the Q&A part is Q&A, not statements. So I want to introduce Emma Fiala, who got our speaker for us. She did a wonderful job. And so Emma is a freelance reporter, and she writes for Mintpress, and she's co-chair of the WAM board.
Hi, everybody. You may have noticed this person up here on the screen. This is our special guest. He can't see you from the screen. He's over there on the table. If you want to wave to him, you might not be familiar with his face, but I'm sure a lot of you here have read something that he's written. His name is MacLeod. He's currently a staff writer with Mintpress News, so he's a colleague of mine there. He has also written with Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, with FAIR. He's also an author. He's written about Venezuela. Some of you might know that book. But he's going to join us. You've pretty much heard about what the plan is. He'll be talking to you a little bit about the situation in Bolivia, and then we'll have a chance to ask him some questions. So thank you, Alan, for joining us. Hopefully you can see the room okay there, and I will let you begin.
All right, so stop me if you can't hear me or see me very well. But yeah, my name's Alan MacLeod, and in 2017 I finished my PhD about the media coverage of Latin American countries. And during that I also got the opportunity to teach at Glasgow University Latin American politics. And since October I've really been covering the events in Bolivia pretty closely. So to give you an overview of what's been going on November 10th, generals appeared on Bolivia's main television network demanding that the newly elected president, Evo Morales, step down. This had followed weeks of unrest and campaign of violence against the ruling mass movement towards socialism party, which saw many mass officials kidnapped or even brutalized. So, for instance, the mayor of Vinto, Patricia Arce, she was kidnapped, she was covered in red paint, and she was then dragged through the streets, had her head shaved, and she was physically and verbally assaulted while she went. And Morales made it clear when he decided to resign that he was doing this mostly on the part of to prevent the violence against his own officials. So the next day, Morales fled to Mexico, and the military handpicked a successor, Janine Áñez. Áñez was perhaps a rather unknown person in Bolivia. She was a senator from quite a rural, out-of-the-way state. She is a strong, strong Christian. You could call her a revanchist, perhaps. She appeared firstly at the presidential palace holding a huge leather-bound Bible saying that Christianity was going to return to the presidential palace. She has called the majority of Bolivia's population, who are indigenous, satanic, and she talks about how she wants to rid Bolivia of satanic indigenous practices, saying that Bolivia's indigenous majority should not live in cities or towns, but should be forced to the Altiplano, the highlands, or the Chaco, the desert. Áñez's party got 4% of the votes in the elections in October, and she immediately gave a carte blanche to the military, pre-exonerating them of all all past and future crimes in the re-establishment of order, as she said. And that was really taken on all sides to mean a license to kill. Other members of the government have put out similarly worrying statements. For instance, the communications minister, Roxana Lazaraga, said that any media network or politician engaged in sedition against the new government would be dealt with and rounded up and detained. Arturo Murillo, who is the new interior minister, said that he was engaged, in his own words, in hunting down mass officials who were like dogs and animals to him. And so we've seen in the last few weeks that the formerly ruling party, the MAS, the movement towards socialism, has really been criminalized, and many of the high members of MAS are now under charges. Morales himself faces 30 years in prison for crimes against humanity, as Murillo, the interior minister, has filed a case against him at the International Criminal Court. In just a few weeks, Áñez has pushed forward a lot of very forthright foreign policy proposals. She has, for instance, cut off ties with Venezuela, and she has recognized Juan Guaido, the US-backed candidate, as the rightful president of Venezuela. She has expelled 700 Cuban doctors from Bolivia who made up the real backbone of Bolivia's nationalized health service. She has recognized Israel. She has pulled Bolivia out of multiple international and intercontinental treaties like ALBA and UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations. And so really I'm from the UK, she's really done Brexit 3 or 4 times in the last 2-3 weeks. It's been quite remarkable to watch. Many of the military generals and the officers and police who rebelled against Morales and forced him out were trained at the School of the Americas, the notorious school in Fort Benning, Georgia, which has trained tens of thousands of Latin American officers, including many of the worst human rights abusers in Latin American history. For instance, people like General Rios Montt from Guatemala, who was recently convicted of genocide. The new Bolivian government has carried out massacres itself. There have been 2 well-known ones so far, just outside the cities of Cochabamba and La Paz. Mintpress News had a reporter there, 2 reporters actually. Medea Benjamin saw firsthand the massacre, and she talked about how she saw still dripping bodies being taken into churches instead of morgues, because the morgues were just full. And so doctors and priests were giving the last rites and autopsies basically out in the open on the pews. We've also seen how another Mintpress News reporter watched as the funeral procession was tear-gassed. So far, 33 people have died in these massacres that we know about, and many hundreds have been arrested. There's also been something of a war on the media from the new government. Critical independent and international stations like RT and Telesur have been taken off the air. Bolivia TV inside the country was also taken off the air. Some independent journalists have been arrested by the new police force. That was with the help of some local Bolivian journalists as well. An Al Jazeera reporter, an anchor, was actually tear-gassed live in the face at point-blank range by the police force, and that makes for some quite amazing viewing if you haven't seen it. I did want to talk about the US response to this. The Trump administration has lent its full support to the actions. They said in a statement that was released that this is a significant moment for democracy, and that Morales' departure preserves democracy and paves the way for the Bolivian people to have their voices heard, going on to say that the United States applauds the people of Bolivia for demanding freedom. And it also sent out a very chilling message to the rest of Latin America. In the last sentence, they said, "These events send a strong signal to the illegitimate regimes of Venezuela and Nicaragua that democracy and the will of the people will always prevail. We are now one step closer to a completely democratic, prosperous, and free Western Hemisphere." A lot of the violence really started in the wake of the October 20 elections. Most of the polls showed that Evo Morales would win by around 10 or 11 points. The way the Bolivian system works is if one candidate receives 50% or more of the vote in the first round, there's no need for a runoff election. If any candidate receives more than 40% and beats the second candidate by at least 10%, then there's also no need for a runoff. Morales eventually won by 11%. He got 47% of the vote, which was enough to declare him the winner without the need of a runoff. But the opposition cried foul, claiming that actually the vote was tampered with, and that claim was amplified by the Organization of American States and by the US government. However, one careful study by the Washington-based Center for Economic Policy Research suggested that the final election totals were completely in line with what had been announced by the electoral body. What happened is that the quick count showed that Morales was going to win by about 8 or 9%, but in the end, he actually won by 11%. And the reason for that is that the quick count, obviously, after a few hours, the only areas that could have been counted that quickly were highly urban ones. And as everybody in Bolivia knows, Morales pulls his support mostly from the rural community, who tend to be more indigenous. And those constituencies tend to take much longer to count, just for geographical reasons. I wanted to touch on Bolivian or Latin American history, if I could, as well, because I think it's quite important to get a wider background. So obviously 500 years ago, when the Iberians arrived, Bolivia became a slave society for the first time, or at least a chattel slave society for the first time, where small numbers of Iberians, Spanish and Portuguese mostly, enslaved very large numbers of indigenous people, and later also brought some Africans to the country as well to work in the mines, which were incredibly dangerous and took their toll on the human body. There was one mine called Potosi, which is extremely famous because the mountain produced more than half of the world's silver, but the life expectancy for those in the mines was less than 6 months. And even after independence in the 19th century, Bolivia even though slavery was ended, the structure of society did not really change, and we still had a situation where the white elite controlled most of the economic, religious, political, and media power in the country, and the black or indigenous majority really had very little in comparison. So we have a situation in Bolivia, like most of Latin America, where they say the poor are mostly dark and the dark are mostly poor. Fast forward a bit into the 20th century, Bolivia embraced neoliberal economics in the 80s, which led to huge inflation. At one point in 1985, for instance, inflation was running at 13,000%. This forced the country to sell off or break up so many of their nationalized industries, sell them off to Western companies. And what we saw in the 80s and 90s, which epidemiologists often call the lost decade for Latin America, was that poverty and inequality really shot through the roof. And it was this context that really led to Evo Morales coming to power. He was a poor man. He was the first indigenous president of Bolivia for 500 years, or head of state of Bolivia for 500 years. This is in a country where anything up to 85% of the country can be considered indigenous. So if you can imagine if the United States had never had a white president, and then for the next 250 years still never had a white president, it really says something about what's going on there. He was famously a cocalero who grows the coca leaf. That's not to produce cocaine necessarily. In Bolivia, many people, almost everybody, it's almost ubiquitous that people chew coca leaves. It's a decent source of protein and also helps with the high altitude that most of the country is at. He was a trade unionist as well, and organized the peasants into a much more effective political tool. And he really came to prominence after the water wars and the gas wars, where American companies like Bechtel tried to privatize the entire water system, and even managed to get the Bolivian government to pass a law that made it illegal to catch rainwater yourselves. And so we had a situation where Bolivians were literally starting to die of thirst. And this is really when his mass party, the Movement to Socialism, got a big shot in the arm. He was elected in 2005 eventually, and that was very much against what the US government wanted to happen. In fact, only a few days before his election, the US government, the embassy, put out a press release saying that they could never support a mass government and the Bolivian people shouldn't vote for him. This had exactly the opposite effect as they were hoping, as Morales absolutely shot up in the polls after that announcement was made. He has managed to produce some really quite remarkable achievements, which academics, medical staff, sociologists, and many other groups have found very, very interesting indeed. He's been in power for 13 years until he was deposed. The per capita GDP of Bolivia increased by over 50% in those 13 years, and poverty halved, and extreme poverty declined by more than 2/3. He's also had a lot of very successful transport policies. If you ever go to La Paz, you might see the cable cars dotted around the extremely steep city, which has helped ordinary people get down from their houses into the city centre where they work. Although many of the transport policies have been controversial. For instance, they did start building a road through the Amazon, and that really led to a lot of strife with other indigenous groups, which has been much commented upon in the media. Morales almost immediately tried to argue for a new constitution, which Bolivia did pass, which put national sovereignty, inclusiveness, diversity, and equality at its heart. Nationalization of key resources like mines that they have a lot of for, lithium, tin, silver. They also have a lot of gas in the country. These key resources were nationalized, and it was really the core of what Morales was able to do. You really could not have transformed the country without reasserting democratic control over the economy. So one example was that he managed to renationalize the energy sector. Before him, US corporations, or Western corporations, had signed an 82-18 split, where they would take 82% of the revenue and leave the Bolivian government with 18%. Morales came to power and immediately decided to reverse that, offering the corporations a take it or leave it deal, where the Bolivian government would get 82% and the Western corporations would take 18%. And in the end, the corporations accepted it. What that meant was that the revenues for Bolivia went up from 730 million from the hydrocarbon industry to almost 5 billion, almost overnight. Bolivia is obviously still a very poor country, and many people are frustrated at the pace of progress, and still others question, what sort of progress they're actually having. But regardless, Morales was still a very popular leader by the time he was deposed, which could be seen by the fact that he won re-election by 11 points. Many people have talked about the US government. There's a lot of speculation in how much the United States has been involved in this coup. What we do know for sure is that they trained, supported, and funded anti-Morales groups for over 10 years, almost from the beginning of Morales' reign. In 2009, they supported a secessionist movement where the eastern part of Bolivia, the much more richer, much more white, much more urbanized part of the country, tried to break away and form their own state. However, that was absolutely rejected by Lula da Silva, the progressive president of Brazil, who said he could never support such a thing. And so that attempt really fell by the wayside. They've certainly been very happy at events. I did quote that White House statement before. They immediately recognized the government of Janine Áñez and has not really put out any condemnation of the massacres or any other repression that's been going on. We do also have some reports that Senators Bob Menendez and Marco Rubio had a lot of contact with these coup leaders before it happened. And so that's a developing story, but we'll see. What we do know for sure is that they were extremely happy that the coup took place. The international media has been pretty much on par with the US government. We've seen the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal's editorial boards all come out and strongly support the coup, saying that actually Morales resigned and this is a step forward for democracy. And pretty much every major outlet has been the same. ABC, CBS, Fox News have all come out and said that really what happened was an infuriated population took to the streets to demand Morales resign after a questionable or fishy vote. One last thing I'll say is, of course, there was a situation where there was a discussion whether Morales should be standing at all in this election, because a few years ago the Bolivian people did have a referendum and narrowly voted, I think it was 51-49, to keep term limits in place, which effectively meant that Morales would not be able to stand for another term. However, the Supreme Court decided that this was actually a violation of fundamental rights and the Constitution, and they overruled the referendum and said that Morales could stand. So it's a little bit controversial that Morales was standing in the first place. However, it seems pretty clear that the Bolivian people were essentially okay with that, seeing as Morales did win by such a large percentage. And not only that, a lot of media outlets have said that, well, Morales standing for a third term kind of justifies that the coup happened. I really don't think we can go that far to say that actually just because there's a slight consternation about whether somebody should be allowed to stand for a third time or not, that justifies a coup happening. I could talk for a long time, but I know I've already talked for about 25 minutes, so I think generally question and answers tend to be a more interesting part, and it would allow you guys to speak, because it sounds, certainly from the introduction, that everybody here is you're quite an educated, clued up audience on the topic.
we're going to have a brief announcement by Kristen before we have Q&A. It will take just a moment.
Hi, thank you. My name is Krista Dooley, and I am Director of WHAM. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you and to ask all of you to become members. There are membership forms back there, and we're also gonna do just a little exercise. I need you to all put your hands in the air. Okay, bring it back down. Now reach behind you. Reach into your wallet. And bring something out, and there are buckets going around, so thank you very much.
We figured we would get your attention about asking for money before we had the Q&A. So I think it would be better if we turn the lights out to see the screen better.
Well, then I can't get faces.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
a compromise?
Yeah, a compromise, all right. So
No.
I'm going to just recognize people. Mary Jean is going to tell you when you should stop talking because, again, these are questions, not statements. Okay, I saw your hand first.
Do you want me to use the microphone?
Hello, thank you very much for your excellent talk. My question is, what do you think is sort of the next stage for this story? I know protests have continued, and I know that Evo Morales has said that he hasn't given up his fight either. But it's hard as a solidarity activist to sort of know where the story is going, and it's not like the Western media is giving us very much indication of sort of where it's going. So that would be helpful.
Do you want to do one by one, yeah?
Yeah.
Sure, so the next stage, well, it seems that sometimes this government appears unable to hide how comically evil it is. You know, for instance, just on Thursday, I think it was, the Interior Ministry decided to announce that they had a new 50-man strong battalion of highly militarized, black-clad, masked, carrying automatic weapons police squad that they said would be designated against foreign terrorists and people who commit sedition. And the Interior Minister immediately started fingering an Argentinian human rights group as an example of the sort of people that would be targeted by this new police force. And lo and behold, the next day, 14 members of that human rights group, including lawyers, medics, unionists, were in fact arrested. Clearly, the government is trying to consolidate its power. Certainly, Morales hasn't given up hope. He continues to talk as if he is the president. But I think the longer this goes on, the more likely that the coup plotters will, in fact, get away with it. Talking to people who are in Bolivia, other journalists, they say that one thing that is missing from a lot of the coverage is that people in Bolivia really have no idea what's going on because they have a limited media, and moreover, almost all of the media supported this coup because inside Latin America, very, very often we see a very high concentration of media ownership, and that concentration tends to be linked with the oligarchical elites of these countries. And so basically these elites have endorsed the events and have even, in some cases, helped round up alternative voices and take them off the air. As I said before, international news stations that carry a different message have already been shut down. And so the next stage of this, I think, for the government there is try to consolidate and try to get more international recognition. That's not a very hopeful message. Another very unhopeful message is the international situation, which the introducer was talking about before. We've seen multiple new attempts from the Trump administration to try to overthrow or at least create havoc in other countries. just right now we've seen one in Dominica, in Venezuela. There was a second coup attempt in November, which actually fell flat on its face, and so most people don't know about it. We're seeing the Trump administration looking at trying to target Nicaragua as well for sanctions and perhaps more. So I think the next part of this is a sort of second round of Operation Condor, which went on in the 70s, where the US was overthrowing governments left, right, and center.
Another question? Go ahead. Please kind of, I'm just going to ask everybody if you kind of face that way because of the Facebook Live, so.
And Alan sees you from here.
Yeah, that's right. You're actually
Right there.
Yes.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you have any references or citations regarding the achievements of the Morales administration. You mentioned that he had managed to reduce absolute poverty by 2/3 and improve the GNP by 50% or something. Because I think, you know, when I talk to other people, my being able to give them that kind of solid evidence can be very convincing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose most people aren't going to go digging through World Bank data or anything, although there are lots of interactive sites, for instance, at the World Bank, where you just type in the country Bolivia and it will just show you all the graphs for unemployment, hunger, all of that. But one resource which might be quite easy to access and use is the Center for Economic Policy Research. It's a think tank based out of Washington, D.C., and a lot of their members have got connections to Latin America, and they've been putting out a lot of very interesting economic and social reports about Bolivia, about Venezuela, about Brazil, for instance, which are really accessible and have been quoted all over the place. So I think cepr.net is a good place to start.
Other questions?
Hello. How big is the U.S. consulate in Bolivia? Does the U.S. have an ambassador to Bolivia? And what's the makeup of the embassy? Like, do we have certain people in the basement that are calling the shots? What's going on?
Well, I actually don't know the answer to that. Maybe somebody here would, but certainly they do have an embassy in Bolivia, and it's provided an important role in Bolivian history. The US was involved in the overthrow of the government back in the 50s. As I said before, they did put out a press release saying that they wouldn't accept a Morales victory in 2005. There was a very interesting survey done on Latin American leaders, heads of state in the early 2000s, and they asked them, do you or the United States Embassy have more power in this country? And more than half of the respondents said that actually the US Embassy, the ambassador, had more power than they did, which I think is pretty interesting. But maybe someone else who either has been to Bolivia recently or at least has had contact with the embassy might have a better answer.
Other questions?
Joe?
Hi, thank you for your over here.
Yeah. Why don't you go stand over there, if you don't mind?
Thank you for your speech.
Stand, she wants to get you on this.
Oh, right here. Okay.
So-
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I would like to have your opinion on the future elections that are going to be taken in April, I think. What are the odds that it's going to be a rigged process? Because the U.S. Embassy, obviously, now it's tracking every leader from the mass and everyone else that could threat the Santa Cruz right wing that
Sure.
size the government right now.
Well, I think you've already almost answered your own question. I'm not sure if the election itself needs to be rigged, because what they've done is they simply criminalize the major party in the country. So I'm not sure if they're going to need to change the vote tallies at all, because Evo Morales, Alvaro Garcia Linera, the vice president, are both in hiding in another country, have taken asylum. Tons of mass officials have been either arrested, detained, or in hiding. And so the idea that we could have some sort of free and fair election under those rules seems to be absurd, frankly. So there might be an election, there might not be, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see rather a lot of parties not even taking part. I would be surprised if MAS, for instance, deigned to legitimize these elections by even deciding to take part.
One of the audience members here just said to me, it's just like what happened in Haiti, where in Haiti, the Aristide, who was the president, and his whole party was outlawed and made criminal. So this is obviously a U.S. tactic, like other tactics that they have.
So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I looked at in Wikipedia and counted a coup every year and a half from 1960 until Evo Morales was thrown out of office, not including the 13 years that he governed. So do you really expect an election? And the other question is the connection, between what's going on in Brazil. The left has declared it a fascist government. What's happened in Argentina with Cristina, and Paraguay with Lugo, and what's going on all over South and Central America.
Yeah, so Evo Morales was part of what they call the pink tide, which was in the 2000s, a very large wave of left of center anti-imperialists, heads of state were elected into positions of power across Latin America. Some of the most famous were Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, President Lula and President Dilma in Brazil, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner and Nestor Kirchner in Argentina. By 2011, which was really the high point of the Latin American economy, we saw the vast majority of South Americans were living under either a social democratic or even further to the left government. Together, they started building institutions to try to create an independent future together, because they realized that it was only really through unity that there would be strength and independence from from Europe and the United States, frankly. What happened was that certainly after the 2008 financial crisis and the 2011 slowdown of the Chinese economy, we really saw a lot of these leftist governments being put into trouble, because Latin American economies are much less diverse than European or American or even Asian economies. Most of these societies export one or two or maybe three primary products to Asia or to North America for export. So for instance, in Venezuela it's oil, in Bolivia it's tin and gas, in Chile it's copper. And if those prices start tanking, the entire economy collapses because it's based on one product. And we saw that in the tough economic times since 2011, the right has really used this to come to power, sometimes extra legally, with the help of the US government. So for instance, in 2016, President Dilma Rousseff was taken down in a constitutional coup. We saw in 2012 that President of Paraguay, Fernando Lugo, was also removed via legal means. And we've also seen attempts in other in other countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, for more direct US action. And this really is what I would call, if I was writing a book about this, the empire striking back, trying to use the tough economic times to push through governments that are more conducive to their interests. And this is just the latest example of it.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation, but I wanted to ask, what I heard though on the radio is that Germany had bid for the lithium in Bolivia, and Morales decided to reverse that and take them out, but the new so-called government put it back into place. But you said tin, silver, and what was the other export?
Gas.
Well, there's natural gas, there's lithium as well from Bolivia.
Okay.
Yeah, so the country has a number of primary products that it sells to Western markets, but they tend to be completely unfinished. So for instance, Bolivia will sell raw lithium to Japan and China and the United States, and then import batteries and cell phones, which are far, far, far more expensive than the primary product. And so it's a bit of a losing game for them.
Don't you think we could have a better economic system than people having to export? I know that Venezuela is probably the largest holder of oil reserves in the world, but because of climate disruption, we don't want to have all that oil out on the market. So isn't there a better way of supporting people in countries like that in a much more equitable fashion than what's happening now?
That's a great question. Great question. I think that clearly there should be, yeah. Throughout the 20th century, Latin Americans realized this problem, and the United Nations helped them with something called ISI, import, substitution, importation, industrialization, sorry. And the whole point was trying to diversify their economy. So the point was that, for instance, Venezuela didn't want to just export bauxite, which turns into aluminium. They started trying to produce cars in the 1960s and 70s with some success. And we also saw this model being deployed in the southern cone. So, you know, Chile and Argentina and Uruguay, which sell a lot of meat, started diversifying into leather products, making shoes, making high quality clothing, etc., which really helped their economies. In fact, if Chile and Argentina had continued their economic growth and their trajectory from the early 1970s to now, they would actually have the highest standards of living anywhere in the world. But that was cut down when the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, started really getting involved in the 1970s and the 1980s and insisting that countries keep this old export model where they continue to be what they call the periphery nations, exporting to the core nations, which is North America and Europe. And since then, yes, the economic model continues to be stunted across the entire region.
Hello. My question is how, if there's like any kind of relationship between the coup plotters in Bolivia and like Guaido and Lopez in Venezuela, they're running the same playbook, and the U.S. involvement is very clear, but what relationship those two groupings have?
Yeah, good question. There is a relationship because almost immediately Janine Áñez recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela, even though he is just holed up in his house, never goes to the parliament, and in fact, apparently I hear that when he tries to go to restaurants, he's just pelted with food by angry people. So he's kind of stuck in his own mansion all the time. Guaido also immediately recognized Áñez, so they do have a relationship. I'm not sure if they are particularly, intimate in terms of having a lot of contacts, but I mean, I think they can clearly see that, Áñez is really the Bolivian Guaido in the sense that they are both supported, but from outside, that's primarily their constituency, primarily the United States and Europe. with the backing of international organizations like the OAS. But yeah, for sure, there are a lot of similarities between Guaido and Áñez. And I think if Guaido were to come to power, we might see similar events unfold in Venezuela.
I'll try to make this quick. I was just down at the SOA Watch in Georgia last month, and of course it was very timely because many of the Coup participants were trained right there, and that WINSEC, it's not called the SOA anymore. It's called WINSEC, Western Hemisphere Institute of Security, and it's doing the same old thing that they did before. But my question is, strategically, if I could ever say the word strategically, where do we go from here? I mean, with Veterans for Peace, we're involved with the SOA Watch and the WINSEC and trying to raise the awareness of that school and try to get that funding shut off there. But what other strategies? Right now we're in the informational, getting the word out, but what other strategies would you suggest we as citizens do?
Yeah, really good question. I was expecting somebody to ask, what do we do? Just before that, yeah, the School of the Americas, yeah, it constantly changes its name. It's a bit like that mercenary army group Blackwater, which continues to change its name every 6 months because it gets such bad press. But whatever they call it, now it's called WINSEC. I think it's Father Roy Bourgeois who stays there near Fort Benning and has done incredible work in really highlighting what that organization does. In terms of what to do, I think generally on these issues, I say as an individual, you can do very little, and it's only by coming together with different groups of like-minded people, maybe in churches or in unions or in community organizations, that you can really start to have some sort of effect. Obviously, most Americans still don't have a passport, and even those who do, the majority of people just go to Mexico either to see their family or to have spring break-like vacations. And so there's not that much real knowledge or understanding of the rest of the world, certainly not in Bolivia. So I think even talking about this, even raising the alarm is certainly worth doing, just talking to ordinary people about this. What I would say is that organized groups have managed to start pushing a much more peaceful foreign policy on certain candidates. So for instance, it was interesting to see pressure on Bernie Sanders, Tulsi Gabbard, Elizabeth Warren, for instance, to come out and make a statement about Bolivia. And the first two, Sanders and Gabbard, completely rejected the coup entirely, as have many quite high-profile Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar, for instance. She's been totally against the coup in Bolivia. And so generally, I think what I'd say is like so many of these issues that if you care about, maybe you care about Palestine activism or environmental degradation, none of this is really probably going to change without a political sea change in the US. But what I would say is that things are certainly changing politically in the US, and so this might be a very good time to get your message across inside certain political movements.
I want to suggest to people that Ilhan Omar, our congressperson here, needs to hear from you, just a little message online or however you convey messages to her, thanking her for her position on Bolivia, the coup. So, no, anybody else?
Hi, and thank you. Dave just stole my question about what can we do here. But one thing that I do want to say is we could support journalists who are working in Bolivia now hint, hint. Because we are getting information in this day and age that took us years to get when, like, the Vietnam War was going on. We're getting it in real time now, and it's a very huge privilege of people here. And we need to take their articles and post them and repost them and share. And I don't know if you have, I know you work for Mintpress, I don't know if you have your own account or something, but I do want to encourage people to support these kind of reports. Thanks.
Anybody else have questions? Oh.
I've already asked one, but I have a second question.
As long as everybody else has asked the
Lucia
question.
had a
Lucia had a question.
Oh, I'm
I
sorry.
don't really have a question. I'm live, it's a lie.
Watch the cord there. Yeah, I do see it.
It's not really a question, and I'm not supposed to make it, except, let's see, I can't really turn it into a question. There are about 40 people here, and I wanted you to know that, Alan. Hearing from you on Monday, there's a film here, Undeterred, and it's important that we invite people to come and hear that and see the film. And you know, the Minnesota Attorney General, Keith Ellison, recently went to, longtime activist then who got elected to Congress and now is our Attorney General, but in Minnesota, but he did recently, in November, go to Honduras and El Salvador, and he's doing a presentation on Thursday evening at 6 p.m. at Walker Church. And I think that's an opportunity for us to press him. And he has a little power in the state of Minnesota, so let's do that. And I yield my time to Meredith.
So we will have time for announcements and discussion after we're finished with the question and answer. So feel free to make your announcements then.
Okay. I have a question because I can follow the rules. Good. So my question for you is, I know that you talked about Medea Benjamin and the role that she has played as an activist showing solidarity. We have some people in this audience who've gone on solidarity trips in the past to show, to sort of, in addition to the media like Kristen talked about, to have that sort of activist to activist solidarity and to bring those messages directly. I have not heard of anyone organizing a delegation like that to Bolivia, and so I was wondering if you knew of any groups that were doing that. I recognize, because I was paying attention during your presentation, that the situation is intense, right? Like the work that you were talking about with, you know, the way that the Argentinian Human Rights Organization was targeted, et cetera. I understand that, but I'm just wondering if anybody is doing that type of work, because I know some people would be interested in going.
Great idea, yeah. I'm not aware of any groups doing that, but that has traditionally really had a positive effect. You know, probably a lot of you know that a lot of the dirty wars in Latin America could have actually been a lot worse if it weren't for huge numbers of Americans, generally from conservative churches in the South, who went over to Nicaragua or El Salvador or Honduras and just stayed in villages, and just because they were American and white, death squads thought, well, maybe we won't do what we were going to do here, maybe we'll put it off for a little while. That's enormously dangerous, of course, and you've got to be prepared for that, but certainly I think we shouldn't underestimate how much power we do have to change things.
Yeah.
Let me just get back.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
I've been trying to follow the events in Bolivia online a little bit. Southfront.org has some stuff, and I'm curious as to what you perceive the Israeli regime's role in all this is.
You're up.
Can you just repeat who's goal in all of this?
The Israeli
The
rule.
Israeli regime's role in all this.
I think Israelis don't have particularly very much to do with the situation. The United States considers the region its own backyard, Israel has certainly welcomed the coup. It's welcomed Jeanine Áñez as the rightful president, but I wouldn't really have expected anything different because Israel, if you look at things like the United Nations votes, is the country that most closely follows whatever the United States does. So I wasn't surprised to see that Israel had welcomed the coup. There has been a lot of quite nonsensical word salad coming out of places like the Organization of American States, saying that countries like Venezuela and Bolivia were homes of Hezbollah and were training Lebanese militants to fight all over the continent, which might have been influenced by some sort of Israeli conspiracy theory. But yeah, I don't think the government of Israel has very much to do with it. Frankly, I think it's a bit closer to home.
Where's he?
Yeah.
Let me just get over here.
I just want to reiterate, people know this is being live streamed, and thanks to Emma and her wide circle, at one point we had 150 people tuning in. So, and she's also been posting a lot of links to useful sources, so please go to Facebook and share this as widely as you can, and it will be on YouTube shortly as well. I mean, where else are we going to get speakers about Bolivia here in the Twin Cities? So thanks so much, Emma. Thank you.
Can I expand on what you
Yeah,
yeah, like you just heard, I've been putting a bunch of links in the comments on the live stream, so people who are watching right now, you've seen me doing that, but if you guys go back and you want links to things, Alan, I put your author link for Mintpress on there, as well as your Twitter. I don't know if there's anything else that you want us to share.
No, that's fine,
If
yeah.
that's good enough, I also linked to Wyatt Reed's Twitter account. He's been in Bolivia, and I believe he's traveling back to the U.S. today. But he was the one who witnessed the tear gassing of the funeral procession, so his Twitter feed is a really good place, along with a couple of other journalists who have been there. And then I also put in a link to Medea Benjamin's Facebook page. That's where she was live streaming from when she was capturing things while she was there. Obviously, I have to dig through that because she's posted a lot since then, but just go check out those links.
Thank you. Any last questions? Great, all right. Thank you very much. This has been really wonderful. I really like, I know everybody here has, so we really appreciate it.
Can I make a couple announcements?
Not
Okay.
yet.
Goodbye, thank you so much. So we're going to have more discussion?
Yeah.
Should I keep this on, or what?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, all right, so, okay, now we're gonna have discussion, we're off of Skype, and I think Carla is going to tell us a little bit about some of the responses of people from Skype.
I haven't been monitoring them. Emma has.
Oh, Emma, do you wanna?
There's one woman who said, what's there to hate about it? Everybody's happy and they got a woman president.
Yeah. Is there any, do you want to wait and do it? Okay.
All right, well, Joe has an announcement meanwhile, so.
Actually, a couple of quick announcements. The organization Puerto Ricans in Minnesota is planning to organize a Midwest Regional Congress for Puerto Rican independence, April 25th, here at the University of Minnesota. And there's an initial planning meeting this Tuesday at 6 p.m. here at 4200 Cedar. And they're inviting anyone who wants to help work on that. And I'd also like to announce there's a Honduran family, the Lopez family, which is being hosted here by immigrant rights activist Sarah Lechner. They have a court hearing Thursday morning, 9:30 a.m. at the immigration complex at Fort Snelling. It's just an initial hearing, but I'm a firm believer that if people show up for support, it helps. And after this event here, we're going to have a Minnesota Peace Action Coalition meeting planning for protest actions against U.S. intervention around the world.
Okay, I before we go on, I also want to announce that our next coffee hour will be Saturday, January 11th, again from 9:30 to noon. And we haven't decided on the focus yet because it seems like things are changing so fast every day in our hemisphere that we're going to kind of get closer to the time and decide which country we want to focus on next time. So, okay, there's a couple of hands. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I need a microphone, but, yeah, you know, I'm going to Cuba next Saturday. I'll be there. And Barry Reed from Vets for Peace, so I'm also with Vets for Peace. We'll be going to Cuba at the same time, and Medea will be down there. And so I totally intend, she's my favorite dance partner of all time. But I totally, in between dancing, I would like to get her to Skype in about, we're gonna come back and talk about the Cuban, our Cuban adventure and educational opportunity at the next coffee hour. That would be part of it. You could probably have other things that you could bring in. But I'll see if I can get Medea to Skype in, because she'll have a lot to say about Bolivia, of course, since hopefully she's getting out there in time, because I gotta have somebody to dance with.
And I don't know if you know that Evo Morales went to Cuba yesterday. They decided that Mexico is not the safest place in terms of U.S. intervention for him, and so he went to Cuba, and I think he's going to stay there for a while, but I don't know that it's for any length of time, but for right now. So maybe you could see him walking down the street.
Well, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, right.
Could he join us by us?
Yeah, we could ask him to join us.
I'll work on it.
Okay, Kristen.
We get things at the WHAM office all the time. This is a book by a whistleblower he was a professor at West Point, and he blew the whistle on West Point not standing up to the moral and just principles of the U.S. military, and he sent it to us to see if we wanted to read it and review it for so if anybody's interested in propping up the moral justice of the U.S. military and would write a report for us, you can have it, okay? Anyone?
So first off, I was passing out flyers before for the Anti-War Committee's upcoming Human Rights Day protest. If you didn't get one, you're invited, but Bolivia will be one of the things that we're talking about at that protest. But additionally, I just wanted to, since this is the discussion part, I wanted to piggyback off of, I know that there are several people here who have been to Venezuela, and I think it's important to give credit where credit is due, that I feel like part of the reason why there is this resistance movement that's been happening in Bolivia is that people have seen that if the U.S. tries to overthrow your government, if you keep fighting in the streets, you could win. You know, I mean, Venezuela has a history of being able to be like, no, we're not taking that guy for our president. We already picked one, and we want him. And so I feel like that's really inspiring, but I also feel like that gives us a responsibility as the people who live in the country that is funding and training and supporting the coup to be able to do our share of that work as well.
Anybody else want to say something, announce something? This is your chance. Okay. Oh, John.
Towards Carla.
Oh, hi. No, just to wrap up the discussion on Bolivia, what's going on, I would like to listen opinion of anyone about what could have happened for this situation. What went wrong? What could be fixed in the future? Because 14 years, almost 14 years of progressive change in favor of the people of Bolivia are now in peril, and that's not good. So, what could have been done to avoid this? What are the lessons that, for us as a progressive movement, what can we do here, also in the United States, to avoid that situation in an eventual future?
Come right up.
I can't help it. For all the, is this on? Yeah. For all the Bernie Sanders lovers, okay? One of the things I tell the Bernie Sanders people, because I give them $10 a month and they're on me to, help them, I always hammer them on Bernie's terrible position on Venezuela, okay? And the one thing I learned from the Brazilians, who have 24 political parties, is you have to have coalitions. But you always tell your member when you disagree with them. So don't just go rooting for Bernie Sanders without hammering him on his position on anything in Central and South America. That's my point.
Anybody else have anything they want to say? It's a quiet group. Oh, go ahead.
A lot of you guys know Gail Hughes. She's been,
It's the mic.
a lot of you guys know Gail Hughes. She's been quietly hosting meetings on the 5G issue. And last night we rented this room. We got a few people to show up, but we think it's extremely critical. Of all the ways we're being attacked, that's probably the most direct and imminent for shortening our lifespans. We're trying to have another meeting in January. The website we're using to post information is called terransociety.org, which is unrelated to the 5G issue, but it's a place we can post stuff. So
On the WAM calendar.
we're going to try to, on the map calendar?
WAM calendar.
WAM, try to get it on the WAM calendar?
Yes.
Great.
I think it's possible.
Okay, I'll take questions.
I heard Bernie Sanders being interviewed by Michael Barbaro the other day. And when Michael Barbaro asked him about his trip to Nicaragua when the Sandinistas got into power and he shook, I can't think, Daniel Ortega's hand. He didn't want to get into that because it makes him more of a leftist. And he doesn't want to go back into the past like that. He's got enough trouble being criticized for all the things he's talking about, which I think are wonderful. But too many people don't. And I think that's a shame. But anyway, he doesn't want to be reminded of that because it just, for some people, it makes him look like some leftist kook.
Okay. Anybody else have anything you want to say about leftist kooks or other people? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for coming today. This has been great. I really appreciate it. And thank you again, Emma, for arranging for Ellen and with us via Skype. And Carla to make it happen.